Now, Holland and a number of other Labour Party MPs were on the boat and found out about this and basically put a complete stop to it. But the New Zealand, our role in that incident, or that, was just absolutely appalling. And it's brought out in this book by James, and the detail that he's put into this is just a fantastic effort. I'd like to pass over to Jim, and what we're going to do is Jim and James will converse, and then we'll open questions up to the audience. Jim.
Okay, well, good evening everyone. Tērā tātou katoa. You can hear that all right? Yes. Yep, good, okay. No, well, it's good to be up here with you, and it's especially good to be able to acknowledge this book. It's a book I've enjoyed very much. It's a book that really needed to be written. I've long thought that Harry Holland has had a rough go at the hands of some of my historian colleagues, and the balance has now been set right. What we have here is a very carefully researched, very powerful book about somebody who has to be regarded now as one of Australia and New Zealand's major socialist thinkers and major socialist politicians. So it's great to be able to reflect on and discuss this work. And I guess, James, the first question is, what got you interested in Harry Holland?
Thanks, Jim, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I got interested in Harry Holland when I was a member of the Socialist Action League in the late 70s. I joined that when I was at university, and the Socialist Action League undertook to get all its members into industry to become part of the industrial working class, and I was part of that. I got jobs in the Wellington car plant, and then the freezing works in Hawke's Bay, and part of that whole transition, which was quite a big transition for people like me who didn't come from a working class background, part of it included sort of going back to look at the history of the New Zealand working class and some of its outstanding figures, and Holland loomed large as one of these. I read his book on the tragic story of the Waihi Strike. I don't think there was anything else easily available that I read at the time, and then I read a few other little things about him. I knew he had declared himself a Bolshevik in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. A few little interesting things like that, but and then I also tried to read the biography of him by Patrick O'Farrell, and I found that very unsatisfactory, and it was kind of a bit off-putting. So I didn't really take it any further than that at that stage, but I always sort of had it in mind that he was an interesting figure, and I should look into it a bit further when I got the chance.
And how long did it take you to do the book?
It's hard to say. I started working on it seriously in about 2012, I think, but then and a funny, was published earlier this year, so that's 12 years, but I wasn't working on it continuously all of that time. So,
Yeah, I mean, my own encounter with Holland was, I think, in the early 1980s as a student at Canterbury. I had a brilliant labour history lecturer called Len Richardson, who worked on coal miners, and at that time I'd been reading about the Great Strike of 1913, and that's where I sort of became aware of that radical wing of the labour movement and how critical Harry Holland was to that. Harry Holland's life is the first 44 years is Australia, and then the last 21 is New Zealand, so it's sort of two halves in a way. And obviously his life in Australia before 1912 was fundamental to his politics. So James, I wondered if you can outline how Holland conceived of the working class. Who was the working class for him, and what were the implications of that for his political analysis and his political activism?
It's quite an important place to start, I think, because the working class was really only just emerging as a separate class in Australia and in New Zealand at roughly the same time, sort of towards the end of the 19th century, which might seem strange because Australia had been colonised, 100 years before that, and colonised by a capitalist country, and so you kind of assume that it's capitalist social relations. But I don't think the classes were strongly differentiated. In Australia, the whole development was held back by the fact that it was a penal colony. There were the convicts and there were their jailers, and then there were also a few free farmers, and the proportion of free farmers sort of gradually increased over the time. But then suddenly, towards the end of the 19th century, class differentiation really emerged in a very sharp way. There was a prolonged depression in the last few years of the century. Wage labourers, the working class by that point, consisted of wage labourers in the various industries which had grown up. Miners, maritime workers, the rural workers, shearers and so on were some of the first to get organised and wage strikes in their interest. And then also a few workers in the urban industries like clothing workers and so on, including women workers. In Harry Holland's view, the working class very much included the Kanaka workers on the big plantations in Queensland who worked in sort of semi-slave conditions. But for the most part, the organised workers were European immigrants and their descendants. Aboriginal workers, the Aboriginal population was very little integrated into the urban working class, but out on the farms and so on, Aborigines were a significant part of the working class, including in the region where Harry grew up. He grew up where Canberra is nowadays, although Canberra didn't exist until later. And his goal from early on was to organise a political movement of embracing all of these different elements of the working class.
And of course, the big force in Labour politics, dominant in a way, was the Australian Labour Party. And I think Harry Holland was very critical of that, and I think his perspective is well reflected in your own book. And as I read this, and as I've thought about the Australian Labour Party in other contexts too, it seems very little different from the New Zealand Liberal Party. So there's two things I wonder if you can comment on. One is how you might explain, how you might account for the Australian Labour Party's position and its political conduct, and the effect that had on Harry Holland's socialist politics.
I think you really captured it by saying it's very similar to the New Zealand Liberal Party. The working class had just emerged in both Australia and New Zealand really in the last decade of the century, but consciousness always lags behind the reality, and it took quite a long process before working people kind of recognised the need for their own political party. The first form that took was actually workers consciously allying themselves with other layers of society, in particular the urban manufacturing class. They saw the big landowners and land speculators as the enemy, and saw the manufacturers that they had some common cause with them in the building up of industry. And the New Zealand Liberal Party was explicitly formed on that basis, that sort of class alliance. They called it the Liberal Labour Alliance. In Australia, they call it the Labour Party, but it was basically the same kind of organisation and very, very similar politics. But it is a little bit disorienting at first when you read Harry Holland's Australian stuff, and he's denouncing this Labour Party and saying workers have got to break with this Labour Party, and you think, oh, isn't this the guy who became the leader of the New Zealand Labour Party? But it was a different, it was a very different kind of party. So Harry wanted a party based on the working class, based on the organisations of the working class, the trade unions, independent of the other classes.
One of the issues in debate in the forerunners in New Zealand of the New Zealand Labour Party as it was established in 1916 was the question of whether those who were not members of the working class should be members. And I wonder what Harry's position on that question was. Was he prepared to bring in others under working class leadership, or was he a bit more particular?
They had long debates on this question, which I couldn't quite sort out what they decided in the end. Yeah. But it was a big issue. But because as soon as the Labour Party in New Zealand was formed, it became a pole of attraction, and lots of people who weren't union members wanted to join it. There was a current in the Labour Party that said no, it's for union members, and as soon as you allow other people in, it will become transformed into a party like the Australian Labour Party. The middle class element will soon dominate it. And I think Harry's position was basically that if you agree with the Labour Party program, you should be able to join it. But that the organised strength of the party would remain in the trade unions. But it is a bit related to this question which kind of dominated Harry's whole life, which is the political basis on which you organise a Labour Party, and this idea that he put forward of a party for all the different. He wanted a party that embraced all the different political currents within the working class, which means that, which is a different basis than organising on the basis of agreement with a certain program. So there was a kind of contradiction there right from the start.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that point a bit later when we talk about the 1920s. But one consistent theme in Harry's life is his long and close marriage to Annie. They were married when they were sort of around 20 years of age, and there's that lovely letter just a few days before he dies where he says it's our 45th wedding anniversary, and if possible I love you more even now than I did then. You do say that Annie was a comrade as well as a partner. She's a bit in the background, but she did write a memoir that you've drawn on. Can you say much about Annie Holland, or is she very much in the background? Very much in the background, unfortunately, because you can see enough to know that she was a very close political collaborator with him. They met outside of politics, really, when he was a Salvation Army soapbox preacher, and she was just a Christian who went along to I don't think she was a member of the Salvation Army. He was, obviously, but she went along to one of his sermons, and they started going out, and by coincidence, they happened to have grown up in the same district. She grew up as a part of a farming family on a big estate called Duntroon, which after Duntroon was where the city of Canberra was built, and it became, soon after Canberra was built, it was acquired by the government and turned into a military academy, which I think it still is today. It is,
yeah.
Yeah.
And their parents said that they played together as children, but neither of them remembered that. But they came from a similar background, and then they both went through this political evolution together, and it's very clear that they were kind of, it was a comradeship as well as a relationship of love. However, they had 7 or 8 children together. I think it was 8, and then one of them died. And raising them would have been mostly Annie's job, I think, and so that was probably what she was, mostly concerned with. So you just don't hear much about her really until this little note that you talked about that I drew on. It's a very useful source about Harry's childhood, because actually we don't know very much about his childhood either. He wrote almost nothing about himself, and so these little recollections that were put together by Annie and a couple of friends who had known him in childhood, they're basically the only source we have of about his early life. And it says very little about Annie, unfortunately.
And yet one thing you do show is that Harry was, at least in the progressive wing of his times, in terms of women's economic and political rights. He believed in women's economic citizenship. He was perhaps less traditional than some of his Labour contemporaries, and I'm guessing that there's a bit of Annie's influence in that, perhaps.
Absolutely, I think that's almost certain. It just we can't prove it, but yes, he took up women's causes right from early on. There's a case I write about of Alice Parkinson, who was jailed because she murdered a man who had promised to marry her. The details of it, I can't. They're too complicated to go into. But there was a defence campaign built around her, saying she had been unfairly treated, and Harry supported that. But he'd also supported a similar case in Australia as well. He was concerned with women's social position and women's economic dependence on men as a problem that needed to be addressed by the labour movement.
So if we can jump now a wee bit to their arrival in New Zealand, or Harry's arrival at least, because I think he came on ahead, just as the crisis at Waihi was brewing, just as the major confrontation between the red feds, the employers, the arbitration system, and in due course the Conservative Massey government was all blowing up. How do you think Waihi shaped his view of the labour movement and the working class here in New Zealand?
It was like a rebirth for him, I think. He had been through some very difficult and challenging years in Australia, where he had been personally persecuted, and he had also had political setbacks. You know, the process of winning political independence for the working class was just a lot more difficult and protracted than he had expected, and he had run some unsuccessful electoral campaigns and so on, where he didn't get the support that he expected, and a few setbacks like that, and then compounded by ill health. He had a sort of physical breakdown. He had an injury to his leg which kept sort of flaring up, and it resulted in just the year before he came, he had been hospitalised for months in extreme pain and so on. You know, very difficult circumstances. Then he comes to New Zealand, and he comes just as things are really opening up, and this huge fight against the arbitration system that, by mine workers, waterside workers, and general labourers and others was really opening up, and he sort of jumped right into the middle of it at Waihi. And it must have just seemed like he was in heaven. The dangers were the same, but the general relationship of forces was just very much more favourable in New Zealand for various reasons. And suddenly, and his experience was very much needed, and the experience of his fighting for these things over a period of 20 years was very much in demand, and so he was sort of sent around the whole country talking about Waihi, but also about the whole question of arbitration of labour disputes and workers relying on their own economic power and so on, instead of kneeling before a judge and expecting justice. And that experience was also, Harry's experience was also key to the outcome of the Waihi strike, because they were on the picket line. They were defeated. It was a massive defeat. The strike breakers won the day, and the striking workers were run out of town, literally. And some of them, their houses were set on fire and so on. It seemed like a huge defeat, and Harry was the only one just about who knew that they weren't defeated yet. That we could still fight, and he waged a political campaign to scandalise the strike breakers and their many supporters in the labour movement. And it succeeded. The book that I mentioned, The Tragic Story of the Waihi Strike, was really widely read. It was like the argument for the strike, which hadn't been widely understood by workers until after the picket line defeat. It wasn't widely understood until later, when the militant wing of the workers sort of undertook this massive educational campaign centred around this book or pamphlet, which they printed off in huge numbers, and they had their sort of army of distribution agents sort of taking it around and putting it in the hands of people, and it was key to sort of winning back in the political arena what they'd lost in the industrial arena, and they succeeded in far from being defeated, which the opposing wing, the class collaborationist wing of the labour movement, they were sort of triumphal coming out of this setback on the picket line, and the militants managed to win the leadership of the labour movement over the following sort of 6 months or a year.
Yeah, because I think that period was really formative, and we talked about the Liberal Party here and the Labour part of the Lib-Lab alliance, and part of the context is that after 1905, elements of the union movement tried to establish or sought to establish Labour parties, but they remained committed to arbitration. And there was a range of opinion. I mean, some of them weren't much different from the Liberals. Some of them were more left-wing, but still very committed to parliamentary processes and to arbitration. And a lot of that political element didn't support the Red Feds, didn't support the strikers at Waihi, and in fact, were quite unhelpful, to say the least. And as you say, the response to the picket line defeat, which Harry was heavily involved in, was to transform the labour movement in its political shape as well. And I think too, my feeling is that this was picked up by the rank and file of many of the unions that had formerly been more or less willing to accept arbitration, had believed, I think, that the state could be adapted to workers' purposes. And I think there's a real radicalisation in the wake of the picket line defeat, and especially the death of the miner Fred Evans at Waihi. And so by the beginning of 1913, you've got a push for unity, which brings a lot of the more skilled and previously arbitrationist unions into a more radical perspective. Formation of the new Social Democratic Party, the new United Federation of Labour. And very quickly, employers, farmers and the Conservative Massey government basically organised to break this new movement before it gets off the ground. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, although I think they were starting well before 1912. Massey in particular was kind of organising to split the small farmers away from the labour movement, because they'd been close in the past in the maritime strike in 1890, and Massey was organising to split the farmers away and turn them against the workers' movement from very, very early on. Certainly that it was accelerated after 1912.
So you get through 1913 into October of that year, what seems like quite a small dispute on the Wellington waterfront lights the fuse of what some historians have called the most intense period of class conflict in New Zealand's history, where pretty much a general strike here in Auckland for a few days, most of the ports out, lots of the mines out, number of other unions out as well in sympathy, and a huge mobilisation and a huge response by employers and the government, special constables, armed police, troops and machine guns on the Wellington waterfront, the whole 9 yards. It was really a very intense year. And again, it was a defeat, but I wonder if 1913 could have turned out differently, and more importantly, what lessons did Holland draw from 1913?
I don't think it could have turned out differently because of the weakness of the militant wing of the labour movement on the question of working farmers. They were completely caught off guard by the mobilisations of farmers to break the strike. And that includes Harry, although he was maybe less surprised by it than a lot of the others. Even he underestimated. I quote speeches where he said, they'll never get enough farmers to break this strike, and he had underestimated it. I think that was the lesson they took from it. That they needed to take this question of the farmers seriously and try and challenge this strike-breaking force that had been raised against it. They were starting to do it in the course of the strike, but it was really a little bit too little, too late to make any difference to the outcome. And it was very deeply. It was a very sort of deeply held theoretical position they had. It was a kind of syndicalist position. They expected that farmers, independent farmers, would basically disappear as a class before long. But capitalist development would put an end to their existence and society. They saw society as being, capitalist societies, polarising into two big warring classes. That's not false in historical terms, but it just kind of led them to neglect the problem of what about the farmers that exist now, and winning them to the side of the labour movement. That was what they spectacularly failed to do in 1913, and that's why Massey had such a huge advantage.
And the other problem there, I guess, is the enormous power of among farmers of all sorts, of the ideology of the freehold and of independent property owning status and all that. It would have been incredibly difficult, I suggest, for a radical Labour Party to have brought farmers into its column.
That's right. It's not a simple problem to deal with. All of those things. Yeah.
The other part of the context of these years, 1912, 13, 14, is increasing militarism, increasing militarisation of society in both Australia and New Zealand. Compulsory peacetime military training in New Zealand from 1911, which was widely resisted by radicals, and then of course conscription during the First World War. And resistance to militarism generally and conscription particularly was fundamental to Holland's politics in a way, and occupied a good deal of his energy. What were his reasons, and how did he analyse these issues, do you think?
It sort of changes over time. His first opposition to militarism, going back to the years in Australia, where the militarist campaign was gathering strength from quite early on, his the first thing he talks about mostly is military strike breaking, of which there had been a few examples, quite serious examples in France of strikes which had been broken up by soldiers and, you know, people killed, strikers killed. And he said, you know, his first warnings against the militarism drive was alerting to the danger of military strike breaking. By about the end of the first decade of the 20th century, it's becoming clear that the First World War is about to happen. You know, these conflicts, the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. I think in Morocco in about 1910, 1911, there was a local war on which Germany took one side and France and Britain the other side, and you could, I mean, it's easy for us to see in hindsight. You can see the beginnings of these conflicts between the major European powers developing. And it was widely discussed in the European workers' movement, and Harry was very much in contact with the European workers' movement. Others were too, but Harry took a particular interest. And the general stance of the working class movement in Europe was that we have to meet the threat of war with the threat of a general strike, and if war is declared between the European powers, we have to answer that with a general strike against the war, and this was quite a widely held opinion among the sort of militant wing of the working class. And that was basically Harry's stance as well. Then that fell apart in 1914. When war was declared, there was no general strike. And the reason for that is because the leadership of the major workers' parties in Germany and France, Britain, they became chauvinists, in some cases virtually overnight. They flipped from supporting a general strike against the war to becoming chauvinists. And this included, for instance, Gustave Hervé in France, who had been jailed for his opposition to the war. He had written a very popular pamphlet against the growing danger of war. Harry had corresponded with Hervé in, I think I've got the name right. Yeah. When he was in prison, and there's actually, you can see the letters from Hervé to Harry thanking him for his support there in the Turnbull Library. Hervé was one of these, the sort of most militant anti-war fighters. When the war was declared, he wrote a little pamphlet lamenting the end of our dream of the strike against war. And then he became a chauvinist. He became one of the most rabid militarist chauvinists. And that was just one influential individual in France. But the same was true of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, who Harry had followed that party very closely. Right from his early days. In fact, some of the workers who were most influential over his thinking were socialist migrants from Germany, of which there were quite a few in Australia. There's quite a big population of German migrants in Australia. You tend to think most of the immigration came from the British Isles, and the majority did, but there was a substantial minority from Germany. I'm getting a little bit lost, I think. But you were asking about his stance on
a stance on militarism, conscription, and we were talking about 1914 and how this great idea of a general strike to stop the war just collapsed.
It collapsed, and most of the people, most of the leadership who had supported that idea became chauvinists. Well, it was a huge shock to Harry, and there was a similar kind of split in the working class here, or in the leadership organisations of the working class. Some became chauvinists. There was this huge sort of pro-war rally at Parliament and so on, and then demonstrations in the streets following that, sort of supporting New Zealand entering the war. Harry was in jail at the time. He had been jailed for sedition for giving some speeches in 1913. So he wasn't there to witness that, but his sons wrote these scathing things. One of his sons was in the Watersiders band. They had a brass band, and his son wrote saying how disgusted he was that they were playing these militaristic hymns. The Watersiders, one of the most defeated, but these were the militants on the waterfront in this band, and they'd been kind of caught up in this, what they called the jingo spirit. Well, Harry was contemptuous of all those who had flipped, and a few others he had worked with too. What was the name of one of the leaders of the maritime strike in England? Ben Tillett.
Yeah.
He had been one of the leaders of the left wing from the English labour movement, who came out to Australia, played a very positive role in developing a sort of class struggle current in the Australian labour movement. Then he became one of these pro-war betrayers as well. So Harry denounced them in no uncertain terms, these betrayers, including the people he had admired in the German Social Democratic Party and so on, and Tillett and the rest of them. But after the general strike against war had collapsed, it was not entirely clear how to oppose the war. The anti-conscription campaign then loomed very large as a means of opposing the war, because conscription was very unpopular, and that became the axis of the campaign against the war, really for the duration of the war years and beyond. And Harry was fully in support of that. And it became the basis on which the Labour Party was founded. In fact, it was its kind of central issue around which the Labour Party was founded in 1916. But it had its weaknesses too. On the one hand, there was a sort of radical part of the anti-conscription campaign which sought to tie the question of conscription to the broader social questions. They're the ones that raised, that said, I thought it was a very good slogan they had of supporting a conscription of wealth before the conscription of men. Basically saying that you want workers to go and sacrifice your lives. Well, we say you sacrifice your wealth first, before anybody is asked to sacrifice their life. On the other hand, a big part of the conscription campaign was also people who supported the war, and that included a lot of the Labour members of Parliament and prominent leaders of the Labour Party and towards the end of the war, in the precursor organisations as well. They would speak at anti-conscription rallies in the morning, and in the afternoon at a pro-war rally. It seems like a contradiction, but it wasn't in their mind. They supported the war. They just wanted it to be a voluntary force. They said this is if you have a volunteer force, it's much more effective in carrying out the war. And so it was a very sort of heterogeneous movement, which is partly why it was such a broad movement as well, because it included all these forces in it.
And yet it did also push out the, if you like, ultimate, the guys that I guess Harry would have described as the ultimate class collaborationists, those who did support conscription in the labour movement. Yeah, they basically trotted off and joined the right wing. And I imagine Harry would have thought that that was no great loss.
Yeah. Yes, I imagine.
But it does also, the breadth of the opposition to conscription, for all sorts of reasons, does foreshadow the range of views and perspectives within the Labour Party as it developed in the 20s. And that's something I'd like to come back to in a couple of minutes. But one thing that's really interesting in your book is as you've just mentioned, the influence that the German Social Democratic Party had on Harry's thinking. It was the largest Marxist party in the world before 1914. It was a truly mass movement, very distinguished theoreticians and thinkers, and apart from the fact that its militancy collapsed in 1914, I'm wondering how that in turn shaped his analysis, and similarly the Russian revolutions of 1917, because I think it's pretty clear that Lenin drew some fairly stern lessons from the betrayal of the German Social Democrats in 1914. I think it probably pushed Lenin towards his view that power needed to be seized. And I wonder what impact the events in Russia in 1917 had on Holland's thinking.
Okay, can we just go back? One thing about the conscription campaign that I meant to say, that Harry's sort of full attention was on this campaign from the more or less from the time he got out of jail. Well, actually, there was one interruption to that. When he got out of jail in 1914, almost as soon as he got out of jail, there was an explosion at the Huntley mine, and he decided that was his top priority to address that question of mine safety and the connection with the fact that the Union had been driven out of the mine just before the explosion and so on. So he was concerned with that issue first. Then he turned his attention to the war and the conscription campaign. He became increasingly focused on the conscientious objectors, and probably his second most well-known pamphlet after the Waihi book was his book Armageddon or Calvary, which was it's a wonderful account actually of the persecution of the conscientious objectors generally. It just is a sort of historical record of what happened to them and who they were, and a whole lot of individual accounts, but also some reflections on the general thing of where they came from. It's a fascinating pamphlet. But what I was going to say is I think his focus on the conscientious objectors was in a way a reflection of this. The old slogan of the general strike against the war. He saw these people as the leadership of the labour movement who could lead a general strike against the war, and that's why he put so much effort into defending them, and including after the war itself, where they were still in jail and barred from government jobs and had all sorts of ongoing persecution. He sort of fought to have them brought back into the leadership of the labour movement. He saw that as extremely important. On the influence of the German party, yes, it was absolutely huge. Harry was the two big influences on Harry, I think, were the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which kind of had their conference in 1905 at the same time as the first Russian Revolution, and the sort of combined impact of those two events was absolutely transformative on the labour movement in Australia and New Zealand. And the IWW put forward this idea of one big party for all the working class. And they meant all the working class, all the tendencies, as I mentioned before, this sort of broad church party of the working class was was very dear to Harry's thinking, very central to his sort of perspectives of how the working class movement was going to develop. And it coincided, as you said, entirely with the influence of the German Social Democratic Party, which had been pursuing that course for a couple of decades prior as well, and had become this hugely influential party in German social life generally. Then came the betrayal of 1914, and this mass party just sort of shattered and became completely ineffective and impotent. And I think that was absolutely shattering for Harry as well. But there was something worse to follow too. After the end of the First World War, you mentioned Lenin and Lenin's perspective for how to fight the wars, to take power from the war makers, and they put that into that perspective came into action in 1917 in Russia. But it also happened in Germany in 1918. There was and that was how the war finally came to an end. When the revolutionary workers of Germany rose up against the war makers of their own country. But once again, this came back to the question of what happened in that party, because the class collaborationist in the revolution that swept Germany from November 1918 through to 1919, this German Social Democratic Party came to power, but it was them that organised the murder of the revolutionary element in that party. That it was under their guidance that Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were murdered by the Freikorps under the direction of this same party. And these were the leaders, the militant leaders, the revolutionary leaders of the German party that Holland identified with and supported. It must have been absolutely crushing, worse than 1914 for that perspective, and for Harry personally. He didn't write anything about it though. There's the only discussion of it that I could find documented was a motion passed at the Wellington Social Democratic Party, I think, or one of the workers' organisations in Wellington, sort of regretting the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg and saying not much else. And Harry never sort of he never draws any conclusions. He doesn't draw the lesson Lenin drew from it, all I can gather is that it was just too painful for him, because it did really throw into question things he had stood for all his life and continued to stand for, really. So he.
You do say that of all his setbacks, the defeat of the German Revolution was the most wounding. I think those are your words. And I think I'm also getting the very clear understanding that until then, Holland had perhaps, we might with hindsight think it was an unreasonable idea, but perhaps not so much at the time. He might have seen the First World War as the beginning of the collapse of capitalism and as provoking a revolutionary crisis. And when the German Revolution fell apart or was betrayed, then, as you say, it was just a terrible defeat. And it's not, I think, the case that Holland then gave up on radical socialism, by no means, but he was now in Parliament. He'd been elected at the beginning of 1918, or mid-1918, for Paddy Webb's seat on the West Coast. And shortly thereafter, he becomes leader of the party, or chairman, I think was the phrase at the time. I don't think he liked the idea of authoritarian leadership. And going back to the broad base of support for the anti-conscription movement and the breadth of opinion and perspective within the New Zealand Labour Party, inside Parliament and out in the 1920s. What do you think he expected from the formation of the New Zealand Labour Party, and did his views of what was possible evolve in the early mid-1920s? How did he come to see parliamentary politics and the struggle for socialism?
That's a very difficult one.
I know.
I think it's true, as you say, he didn't give up on socialist and radical solutions. But I think in the very early period after the First World War, he kind of gave up on them as an immediate perspective. I think he expected, coming out of the First World War, that there would be revolutionary crises in every country, including New Zealand. And certainly there was in Germany, there was in Russia, there were in Italy, Britain even. I mean, these are sort of going down the scale of how serious they were, but they were still significant sort of workers' upsurges coming out of the First World War, but not in New Zealand. Why not in New Zealand? Because I think it was because the economic situation was quite different here. The war had brought about massive economic dislocation across Europe. It wasn't just Russia where people were starving, but Germany as well. Literally, workers were starving to death because of the economic dislocation, and that was a big part of the revolutionary uprisings. In New Zealand, the opposite effect happened. What happened in New Zealand was that New Zealand was a farm for the British armed forces, and Britain still had enough economic reserves to buy New Zealand produce at high prices, artificially high prices throughout the war, and right into the middle of the 1920s. I think 1923, I think they finally dropped them. But they had these artificially high prices. And there was a little economic boom in New Zealand throughout that whole period. You can see the number of the effects on the number of new dairy factories opened in those years, new meatworks opened, the rural economy in particular. And they had enough money so that when the returned soldiers came back, they could fairly generously settle them on farms. They were able to ride out any kind of storm of opposition. It was extremely muted in New Zealand, and of course that meant that Labour's prospects were a lot. There wasn't the discontent driving revolutionaries and socialist sentiments as it was in Europe. And so Harry, while never giving up on his perspectives, he kind of had to keep just sort of adjusting them back and accepting that there were certain things you couldn't do at this time. And that was basically the process of the 1920s. And Harry was the one who sort of made least adjustments. Others wholeheartedly embraced the new situation, abandoned the views they'd held earlier, and actively promoted the Labour Party along this course. Harry was much more kind of reluctant, but he went along with it.
I mean, one point you do make is that there's an inevitable tension between a broad-based party and political clarity. I think you say that on one level the New Zealand Labour Party sacrificed political clarity for unity, but you also make the point that there's the other risk of descending into barren sectarianism, which doesn't get anyone very far either. And as you were speaking just now, I kind of thought that one of the attractive things about Holland, even though intellectually and politically, he was always extremely clear in his thinking, his writing and his speaking. He wasn't the sort of person to purge people. I don't think he ever sort of conducted witch hunts. I think he just let things speak for themselves.
I think that's true of his political personality, yes. I think he sought clarity himself and just liked to let others make their own judgments.
The other thing that really characterised his politics in the 1920s was his anti-imperialism, and that he had engaged with the question of the Irish Revolution in 1916 and 1917, but he was particularly vocal, as you mentioned earlier, about New Zealand's own Pacific empire. You mentioned Fiji informally, but directly, of course, New Zealand's misgovernment and maladministration of the western part of Samoa, which was an enduring disgrace. And I mean, one thing you do make very clear is the scale of that disgrace, such that Black Saturday in 1929, December the 28th, I've come to regard as New Zealand's own Sharpeville. And Holland was extremely vocal for a long time about the iniquities of New Zealand's misrule of Samoa. And of course that's not been forgotten in Samoa. I think when Barb Edmonds helped launch the book, she reflected on her own family's involvement. But why was this question of New Zealand's own branch imperialism and Samoan independence so important to Holland, do you think?
He came at it through the question of indentured labour, which had been an issue back in the Australian labour movement, with the Kanakas who had been basically kidnapped in New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and taken to the Queensland sugar plantations where they worked under semi-slave conditions. There was an element of the labour movement in Australia which sort of blamed these underpaid workers for being underpaid and said they're dragging our wages down, we need to get rid of them. And that had been the majority position in the labour movement. The labour movement came out of a colonial movement. It sort of emerged from that shell, and it sort of bore the scars of that process because of it. And the other thing in Australia too was a massive anti-Chinese campaign too around the time of Federation. Along the same lines, proposals to restrict migration or to impose huge taxes on and so on migrants from China who were coming to work in the gold fields and so on, and they were always pretty small numbers. But that sort of white Australia type chauvinism was a huge issue then. And of course, you know, there were indentured labourers taken by the Germans, by the German colonial administration to Samoa as well. So it was an issue he was kind of familiar with back then. I think so on a certain level, I think it was just an elementary sort of human justice issue for Harry. But then, as well as that, there was this question of does cheap migrant labour lower wages, and if so, what do you do about it? And his solution, which he came to with full clarity under the influence of the IWW. I don't think he was entirely clear on it before. If you excuse me, if you read the labour movement newspapers that he produced in the 1890s, they mostly ignore the issue. To some extent, you can see articles where they sort of, there was one example, one hideous example I saw in one of them where people were sort of mocking the Chinese accent, speaking English, things like that, which I don't know, I doubt very much Harry was responsible for that, but it was in one of his papers. It was... okay, thanks.
A glass of water for either.
Actually, a glass of water might be good, thanks. My voice is cracking, obviously.
Anti-Chinese.
I start on these little stories and then I forget where I've gone. Under the influence of the RWW, he became much clearer on this question of white Australia and racism in general. And his response to the question of cheap migrant labour was to say, organise the migrants, and absolutely refused to accept different wages for workers of different nationalities. Then there will be a strength to the union, not a way of undermining the wages of the white workers. And there are some very good articles where he goes into this in relation to Queensland, because when they did get rid of the migrant workers, when they did, at a certain point, I think around the time of Federation, they basically expelled all of these slaves back to New Caledonia, and white Australian workers took over at these same low wages. And he said, well, this is the history. This is what happens when you don't organise these workers into unions. It undermines everybody's wages. And the question came up again. In fact, it comes up throughout his life. This question of indentured labour. He wrote several pamphlets on it and taking this stance. It also came up in a parliamentary debate on immigration that I reported on in I think 1919, where some of the unions in New Zealand are raising the same thing. The Seafarers Union in particular, trying to organise opposition to having to work alongside Chinese workers on the ships. And Harry basically takes this same stance. He points to some of the Indian workers, most of whom had come from Fiji. And he says how, once they were organised into the union, they became fine unionists along with everybody else. They were a strength to the union, not a weakness. However, in that debate, you can also see this immense pressure he's under to back off from that position, including from every other Labour Party speaker in that debate, some of whom take this horrible chauvinist white New Zealand stance in that debate in 1919. And you can just see the beginnings of Harry kind of bending to that pressure as well. So then Samoa comes along, and this issue is raised again, because after the war, the sort of colonial relationship which... thanks. After the war, New Zealand had conquered Samoa from the Germans. In 1914, it was one of the first armed engagements, although the German colonial administration had abandoned Samoa and didn't oppose the annexation. But Samoa was annexed to New Zealand in 1914. And after the war, that annexation got a kind of League of Nations fig leaf. It was called a League of Nations mandate or something, but it was just basically a continuation of New Zealand colonial rule on behalf of the British Empire, basically. And so the question of Chinese indentured labour came up again. and there was a further debate in Parliament, and Harry argued for the abolition of the indentures without calling for repatriation of the Chinese workers. But then the whole, by that stage already the other thing that happened is the flu epidemic, and the New Zealand authorities accidentally or even possibly on purpose introduce influenza to Samoa, and it has this disastrous consequences. I think 24% or something of the population died in the epidemic, and so there was obviously antagonism towards the New Zealand authorities who permitted that to happen. Meanwhile, in American Samoa, they had proper quarantine, and the influenza never got there at all. So people had relatives in American Samoa, of course. So the contrast was very clear, and the Mau movement, the independence from New Zealand, which had first sprung up under the German colonial rule, suddenly had a resurgence. And Harry, very early on, supported that movement, wrote in defence of it, and also began collaborating with Taisi Olaf Nelson, who was a Samoan Swedish descent, capitalist who was the central leader of that movement, and he basically became a very close collaborator of Nelson for the rest of his life. I had another point I was going to make, but I've forgotten. Sorry.
Yeah, it was. The title of your chapter is his last battle, actually. Although in a way then came along the Great Depression, but Holland never lost interest in Samoa, and I think the rest of the Labour Party sort of copped a lot of credit due to his position after his death. But could we, we can come back to Samoa if you like, but could we look now at the Depression? The previous biographer of Holland, Patrick O'Farrell, nearly 60 years ago now, was no fan of Holland, and he also wrote Holland for the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. And his account is that, in O'Farrell's view, Holland was beaten by the Depression. He couldn't make sense of it, he had no solutions. Bereft, says O'Farrell, of ideas beyond those that had failed, he took refuge in constant and often pointless work, and he was tormented by doubt. How do you think Harry responded to the Depression, and why?
Well, as much as I disagree with O'Farrell's general view of Holland, I think there is a grain of truth in that. I think he, at least at the beginning of the Depression, I think for the first few years, as things just got worse and worse and worse, he was just kind of dazed and confused. It actually started in New Zealand a bit before 1929. New Zealand was already in a quite a serious downturn before then. It's hard to say exactly how bad, because a lot of the statistics they monitor on these things today just weren't kept in those days. But it was, like unemployment figures and things are just much harder to calculate. But it started in about 1927 here and just got worse and worse. And his immediate response actually was just to kind of, was just acts of personal generosity. He gave away what little he had to workers who came to him in dire straits, until he was as poor as them. But it was kind of like that was all he could do, because he had no solutions. A key sort of turning point, I think, in the response of the whole labour movement was when the police attacked a demonstration of unemployed. In fact, it happened more than once, but I think the first one was it suddenly just sort of made it clear that this crisis is not a kind of national crisis that we're all in it together. It's a continuation of the class war that we had in 1913. You know, suddenly there were mounted specials battening the skulls of workers again, and it just kind of snapped everyone out of it, or not everyone, but it just kind of made it clear that this was a class question along with everything else, and we have to approach it like every other class question and start rebuilding the Labour Party. And that's until then, actually the first measures he took went in the opposite direction. As the Labour Party in Parliament supported the Liberal Party as a sort of tactical move to try and, it was a little manoeuvre to try and stop the...
keep Coates out.
To keep Coates out, yeah. But it pointed the Labour Party back in the direction of the old Liberal Party. You know, that was the kind of manoeuvring that the Liberal Party, that they'd broken with 10 years earlier. More than 10 years earlier. But once they kind of regained that class orientation, then a serious movement started to develop. The union movement was in far worse disarray than the Labour Party at that time. You know, it wasn't when I talk about Harry's disorientation, he was not alone. You know, the union movement, their first I forget what the federation was called at the time, but the main organisation of workers, their first response to the growing unemployment was to say, "Oh, women workers should be sacked." I mean, that's how bad it was. The sort of disorientation, because the union movement was in such disarray, that when Harry started putting forward a few the perspective of rebuilding the Labour Party and sweeping the capitalists from office, the whole focus of working class organisation took place within the Labour Party and around a Labour Party electoral things, because you forget how repressive it was. You know, the cops smashing up, physically breaking up demonstrations of unemployed and so on. You didn't have the right to publicly protest on the street, but you did still have the right to go to an election meeting. It was one of the few places where you could sort of meet and organise and discuss solutions for working people. And so a real energetic campaign for a Labour Party victory began, and that was the hard work that Farrell was talking about. It wasn't directionless. That was when the fight back really began.
And I think that part of that fight back was building a coherent program. And that's where what we now call Keynesianism basically was incorporated into the Labour Party's platform. And one thing that I found interesting in what I've read of Holland elsewhere is that I think he was as much in that in 31, 32 as anyone else. I think he was certainly playing a part in rebuilding the party. It's not as perhaps some of the older work suggests, that he had to be got out of the way before the glory days of Savage could take place. But be that as it may, can we go to a counterfactual? What sort of Prime Minister would Harry Holland have been, apart from a very different Prime Minister Holland than the one that we got in 1949, did I say?
I think in power he would have been much like Savage as a Prime Minister. You can only speculate, of course. But it seems to me there's no reason to believe he would have taken any fundamentally different course than what Savage did. Perhaps in relation to the opening of the Second World War, he would have been a little bit more hesitant or reluctant, but even there, I think he would have taken basically the same stance that Savage did too.
Sure.
I just sometimes I like to wonder if there would have been openings for more anti-capitalist activity than there was, but I don't think so.
And you do make the point that what happened after 1935 wasn't just palliatives. It was real gains by and for, particularly by as well as for working people, with all the contradictions that entailed. So, how is Harry Holland important now?
This is the question I find hardest of all to answer. But I think workers are now facing a situation much more like they did when Harry Holland was around than it might have seemed 40 or 50 years ago. 40 or 50 years ago, there was, universal unionism. You were a member of a union at any job you started at, just about as a matter of course. You didn't even have any choice about it. Today, it's much more like the union movement has to be built from scratch in the same way that it did back in Holland's day, and the same issues come up in that context, and so I think there's an awful lot to be learned just from reading how a good, solid class struggle fighter like Harry responded to those things back in those days. Not everything's the same, obviously. There's a lot that's different, but there's enough to make it very worthwhile.
Still worth remembering, worth reflecting on, and some lessons to be drawn there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think we're now going open for questions. Yes.
Yeah. And I'll move the mic if anyone's got a question.
And I'll pass this mic to James.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, good way of doing it.
I don't answer the questions now, he does.
Julie?
Thank you very much for that. I noted in the online biography that Harry died at the funeral of a Maori king, and I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about his relationships with that other aspect of imperialism, Maori.
Yeah, okay. Yes, that's a huge question. Maybe I should have said something better. Is this on? Oh, okay. Where to begin? Māori were have been an important component of the working class in New Zealand right from the start, and even through the sort of nadir of Māori organisation and around the beginning of the 20th century. The labour movement, however, did come out of the colonial population, and so it wasn't necessary. The organisations of the labour movement kind of reflected that. If you read Harry's Waihi Strike book, he talks about this question for the first time, and it's quite interesting because he's come from Australia, quite a different situation, and in the Waihi Strike, a significant fraction of the strike breakers were Māori. The Waihi was in this part of the I guess it's part of the Waikato region where the dispossession had been most thorough. So there was a big population of dispossessed people, fairly marginal to the economic life, and so they were sort of ripe for recruiting as strikebreakers. They could see nothing in their interest in the labour movement because they weren't workers, and so it was a big challenge. And what Harry writes about it is it's kind of well-meaning, but it's also a bit embarrassing to read it today. He goes on about fractions of Māori blood. He says full-blooded Māori wouldn't scab. It's these half-castes, and there's another word for quarter, quadroons and octoroons. It's these weird terms for sort of fractions of blood, and to think that anything can be explained by that is just it really shows a low level of thinking. And that was his starting point on the question in a time when it was a key issue. And you think, he's got a bit to learn on this, but they did learn, because it was a question that they had to challenge, that they had to face, the militant wing of the labour movement. And the next time the issue came up was in the Huntly strike, Huntly coal mining strike, in the heart of the Waikato, heart of the Kingitanga. And this time, a number of the mine workers are themselves Māori. They had unlike at Waihi, where I don't think there were any Māori workers that I'm aware of. It's possible, but I've never seen any evidence. But there were at Huntly, not a big number. They tried to do the same thing. They tried to recruit local Māori as strike breakers, and this time the Māori workers in the strike played a key role in preventing that happening. They went to King Te Rata, who had newly he was new in the role, and they succeeded in getting a statement from him against strike breaking, and they put an end to it. And the Māoriland Worker, the newspaper Harry edited, reported on this in some detail, because everybody could see that it was a huge new development. It was really the first time there had been an alliance between the labour movement and Māori organisations. It wasn't the first sort of Māori organisations. There was a Young Māori Party and things decades before, but this was the first time that the Māori national movement and the labour movement had been aligned, and it was a hugely significant thing. Then later on, the Ratana movement developed in the 1920s and later, and there were Māori members of the Labour Party who facilitated the alliance at that stage too. Harry went to speak at I think 2 or 3 hui at Ratana Pa, and I looked high and low to see if there was a transcription made of those speeches, because it would be very interesting to know. I don't think any record was kept. I don't think he ever wrote the speeches down, and I don't think anybody noted it down, which is a real pity. But he certainly understood the importance of the alliance between Māori and the Labour Party, and worked very hard to build it, and that was reflected in the electoral alliance that happened about 10 years later.
Len.
Thanks. Just interested in the influence of the Russian Revolution on Harry Holland's thoughts and actions and politics. Is it too close? No, I just want to say, Like Gustafsson notes in his biography of Savage that Holland wrote articles about Bolshevism in perspective and Red Russia, and this is in 1933, published in the New Zealand Worker, which was after the Maryland Worker. And I just wondered, like that was 1933. I mean, it was not long before the Labour government was elected. I mean, and he was still writing about the influence of Russia and Bolshevism and so on. So what you saying you think he'd be the same as Savage, but doesn't that point in a different direction, that he may still have been pretty radically revolutionary socialist at that time?
I think subjectively he was. I think he still. I think he still saw. He thought in terms of the necessity of the working class to take political power, but he thought that's what was happening when the Labour Party was elected. He was certainly very positively influenced by the Russian Revolution. He was not alone in that. Actually, quite a few of the other Labour MPs called themselves Bolsheviks and things as well. I can't say which ones off the top of my head. I think Fraser, Semple, yeah, maybe even Paddy Webb at some point. But they mostly repudiated it very quickly. By the early 20s, you know, they wanted to put that behind them. Harry never quite did, and even there was this sort of strange contradiction between what Harry was saying and what the rest of the party leadership was saying. I think about 1924. At that point, there was a party conference, and Fraser was laying down the law about our perspectives and saying that we are. I forget how he put it, but basically insisting that the Labour Party was for legal electoral means only. You know, he was trying to sort of rid the party of any revolutionary influences. At the very same time, Harry wasn't at that conference, he was in Australia. I think he was even being hosted by the Communist Party of Australia, and he was talking about the necessity for the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in fact, they weren't as far apart as it might seem, I think, because, I mean, maybe he was just sort of adapting to his audience or something too in Australia. But I think his conception of the Labour Party taking power was that it was the dictatorship of the proletariat. But it was clear anyway that he was basically conforming to what the rest of the party was doing. Although he subjectively he might have thought of it as differently, but yeah.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks very much, Jim. We'll bring it to an end. I am, you know, just that was an outstanding presentation. I think you should show you. The Fabians have been really privileged to have James come along with his book, and Jim's flown up from Wellington. I just think it's a fantastic event. I'd just like to say we have some more events coming up for you. We've got it's promotional time. We've got France versus England, what happened to the left, and commenting on that will be Mike Smith, ex-General Secretary of the Labour Party and a wonderful Fabian, Jennifer Curtin, from Auckland University, a specialist on French left politics, and Max Harris, who will be commenting on that. We're going to follow that with a fantastic event, an event that'll interest a lot of people. The Congo. Is Kagame the new Putin? And he's gone from being effectively a star of the left. England is sending refugees, to somebody that's assassinating people, his enemies around the globe. So we've got Joseph Kimini from the Congo speaking on this issue. And then we've scored a big hit. We have scored a big hit here. We have Philippa Howden Chapman, and she's on the hook. She hasn't given us a time yet, but Kāinga Ora, the great con, what has been said about Kāinga Ora by the Nats is just complete nonsense. And Philippa is going to expose that, and we're looking forward to it. So look, thank you very much, you guys. What a fantastic event, and really appreciate you coming up. Jim and James, well done, mate. Yeah, thank you, guys.